Hey, Red Clay Rambler fans. I've started working on a new podcast series about the history and impact of the Archie Bray Foundation. If you are a resident artist or have a good story to tell about the foundation, I would love to have your voice be a part of this upcoming series. We've created the Bray Story Line, which was an easy way for you to dial in from your cell phone or any phone and leave us an audio message. You can call the story line at 774-500-BRAY, where you can leave up to a 10-minute message. If you'd prefer to write out your story, you can do that by emailing me at ben@archiebray.org. Thanks in advance, and let's get on with the show. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 441 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm going to be talking with Dan Finnegan. He's been making ceramics since the early 1970s and recently had a retrospective at the University of Mary Washington that drew from over 40 years of his work. In our interview, we talk about his early training at the Winchcombe Pottery under Ray Finch, establishing his studio in Virginia, and the impact of Pottery on the Hill, which is a ceramic invitational he started in Washington, D.C. This year's Pottery on the Hill is happening just around the corner, November the 11th through the 13th at the Hill Center. If you'd like to see examples of Dan's work, you can go to his website. That's danfinneganpottery.com. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. I thought we would start with your time in England. I know that you have some clay experience that predates that, but aesthetically, I feel like your time at Winchcombe is, that's kind of the taproot. So can you talk about how you ended up going there?
So you're right. I met ceramics in college, but wasn't particularly seeing it as a career. But I was also open to a lot of adventure back in those days. I'd hitchhiked across country a few times. And so a woman that I had dated had gone to England to work in a place called the Guild House, which was a craft center for handicapped kids and elderly people. And she asked if I wanted to take her place when she left. And I don't know, I didn't think too hard about it. It was another adventure overseas. And I said yes. I went in January of 1978, and I spent 6 months at this place. 7 miles down the road was the Winchcombe Pottery. And honestly, I didn't know anything about it. I mean, I'd heard of Michael Cardew's name, but I hadn't had a lot of background, and I certainly didn't know any of our history. But this place I went to live was full of their pots. And so I was down there in a flash, and became friends with, at the time, it was a team of 7 people and a few younger people. So I became really fast friends with folks like Xavier Tobez and some of the younger potters who were there. And over time, I wore them down because I had an epiphany. I walked through the door of the pottery, and there were these 7 people who were coming to work at 8 o'clock in the morning and work until 4:30. So it was a job making beautiful, beautiful objects. And that resonated with my working class roots in a really big way. I can still, hear that door. I can still smell the smell as I walked in there. It was really powerful. And for a long time, Ray Finch, who ran the place, kept telling me, no, we don't need anybody else. But eventually someone left, Sidney Tustin, who had worked there for 51 years, having made over 1 million pots in his life. He left, and I moved in, but I moved into the bottom of the ladder. So they gave me a job, and I spent 78 and 79 in the Cotswolds, which is the area where Winchcombe is. And for folks out there who don't know their history, Bernard Leach begot Michael Cardew. And when Michael Cardew left the Leach pottery, he discovered an abandoned country pottery in Winchcombe. And he leased that for a few pounds, basically. But there was a working pottery with a huge bottle kiln that had been built by a builder from Stoke-on-Trent. And because it had formerly been like a brick factory and like a farmhouse pottery. Cardew took it over and turned it into what we call domestic ware over there, making useful pots. And then Ray Finch was his first real pupil. And Ray ended up running the pottery for 60 some years. He made pots till he was 93 years old, and was just an extraordinary, really highly regarded maker, but a very modest, quiet man. No interest in, fame and glory. But he was the leader of this team. I was the tea boy. I mean, my job there, I never made pots on the pottery time. I was there to serve these master potters. We had a huge wood kiln, and we fired that every 3 weeks. So my jobs were moving wood, glazing pots, making clay, loading, unloading kilns, everything to support the team. I also had a wheel that I could work in at night. But I was really a crap potter, Ben. I'd been making. In college, I was mostly interested in sculptural work, and I learned to throw, but I wasn't very adept at it. And so I really kept only a very few things through that time. But it was an extraordinary time in my life, and it did really mark me forever. The work ethic was something I was attracted to. The aesthetic of the place, Cardew sort of explored medieval German salt glaze and 17th century slipware, and those sorts of ideas of form have been my touchstone all my career. So I left there, and I'll talk more about being there, but I left there having a very strong sense of an aesthetic that I wanted to pursue. And I knew what good pots were. I tell people all the time, I didn't make pots for the pottery, but I handled every single pot that was made in that pottery. And I think a lot of information comes through our hands as well as through our eyes. And, knowing the right balance of a pot because you're holding it in your hand, and, and then you were using it in your trailer out back behind the pottery. I mean, we were treated like dogs, really. I guess we were nice pets. I made $30 a week. I had a trailer out back to live in that had cold running water, no bathroom. We had an outdoor toilet that we used, and there were 2 trailers out back. There's another younger guy, Toff Milway, who's my very best friends, and we had our meals together. And the two of us, at that time, it was really the last heyday of the pottery. The pottery went in decline in the middle 80s and 90s because pottery keeps changing. The world of pottery is so different from the 60s to now. And their work, I think, was considered really old-fashioned in a way. It was very simple, mostly a lot of it unglazed and just flashed with the wood firing. We basically had 2 glazes, and a tiny little bit of decoration happened, but it was very much a production, well-crafted production pottery. But we built a salt kiln while I was there. And another part of my education was working alongside Ray and Toff Milway. And Toff's a brilliant potter and engineer, as they figured out how to sort of start this new adventure at the site. And Ray explored salt glaze then the rest of his life, which was really, so it was amazing to be there at the start of it. And it was crazy because we weren't allowed to spend any money on it. We had to scavenge all the materials off the property. And, over 200 years, there's a lot of materials laying around on the property. And we fired it one time. The first time, we did not reach temperature. It was a wood-fired salt kiln. And so we reconfigured the fireboxes and fired it again. And I was telling the story just the other day, as the pots were beautiful, and as Ray took them out of the kiln, every one of them cracked in a spiraling fashion.
Whoa.
Their clay bodies are really high in silica. And, there's clays like that, you can't fire them too hot, too long. And Ray was as calm as could be. He wasn't a man of many words, and he always had a pipe in his mouth. And I was freaking out. I was like, Ray, how can you sit there? And he said, you should see this when it happens in the big kiln, which would have held probably 2,000 pots. So in his lifetime, he'd talked about mixing a glaze wrong on, thousands of pots, and all the woes. I mean, if you read about the early days of the pottery with Cardew, Cardew was a terrible firer. He called himself a mud and water man, and they fired kiln load after kiln load of pots, which they took a hammer to for years. Oh. They could not figure out that bottle kiln. But Ray was a much better technician, and I think once he was in charge, he tightened things up a lot of ways. I asked him one time, what he thought he was doing in his world. And he said, well, I feel like I'm refining Michael's ideas. He didn't feel like he was an innovator like Cardew perhaps was, but he was a brilliant maker and a great, great leader. And, Ray trained, there's more than 90 potters around the world that worked at Winchcombe at one time or another. And a lot of, Johnny Leach and I used to joke that we were both T-boys at the pottery at different times. So, he influenced a lot of people very, very quietly, and certainly me. It was just an extraordinary time, and everybody came to the pottery in those days. Michael was not well when I was there. And in fact, I was going to visit him when he died. I was on the road to go see him when he died. But his sons used to come to the pottery, and we met Wally Keeler and Mike Dodd, and all these great British potters came through there. So for me, as this young American who didn't really know much, it was extraordinary, and it kind of took years to process all the things. And then the great thing is that I became best friends with my friend Toff, and I've spent almost every summer over there since. I ended up in Virginia, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but I despise the summers in Virginia.
It's very hot and humid where you are.
Oh, I'm from Buffalo, New York, and I just never have embraced the summers. And so I had a retail shop. Business was slow. I turned it over to my helpers because I've had apprentices or assistants for a long time. And I would then go and work at my friend's studio for a couple of months every summer. So I've kept a real strong connection there, and exhibited and done workshops and things like that. So and it's a place I could have spent my life, truthfully. I probably, until 10 years ago, I was probably better known there than here, because here I had a retail shop and I sold everything at the front door of my shop. So there was really no need to get to go to shows or be involved in the wider pottery world. And it's only in the last 10, 15 years that sort of happened over here, which I'm delighted by.
Well, I wanted to back up and make sure people understand that when you say T-boy, you literally brought tea to the potters. And that is a part of a schedule. Like you mentioned, they start at 8, tea is 10, lunch is noon, tea is, what's the second one, 3?
3, yep.
And then you stop at 4:30. So the tea becomes not only nourishment, but is a ritualized way of working.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell me about what you learned from that pace of working?
Well, it was extraordinary, and it's very wise of you to point that out, because it was a really important thing to everybody on the staff. And there were also 3 other craftsmen on the site of the pottery, a wood turner, a furniture maker, and a sculptor. And we all stopped at 10 o'clock and went to the tea room. We had a room that, there were pots everywhere, but it was devoted to chairs. Everyone sat down around a coal stove. It was terrifying at the beginning to make tea for English people. And in fact, I was late the first time by a couple of minutes, and I got a lot of stick for it because it ended at 10:15, regardless of what time it started. And people were really good about that. But it was an incredible time for conversation. I remember I was there when 3 Mile Island happened. And so, I mean, all the events of the world were discussed in that time. There was also lots of talk about the history of the pottery. And again, people came to visit. People knew what time tea was, and they came. And my friend Toff still lives that life today. I'm not as regimented. I kind of drink tea all day. But when I go to England, I slip right back into that world where, you do this at this time. And it's so civilized, Ben. We don't take that time. I find myself walking around my studio carrying my cup of tea instead of sitting and, taking a breath. And especially in that environment, the conversation was just quite amazing. And it was a very hilarious place to be. I mean, the reason that I survived is because the British don't think Americans have much of a sense of humor about ourselves. And I tend to agree with that. Fortunately, I do. I can laugh at myself, and I can be laughed at by other people. So the fact that I'm not just an American, but an Irish American, gave them plenty of fruit to pick on.
Yeah, I wondered about that. I mean, Finnegan is like as Irish as it gets. So did they roast you a lot because of
Yes.
that?
Yeah, not a lot, but that definitely came up. It definitely came up. But, every time there was an election, and all these years I've been going back there, every time there's an election, it's like, I have to go there and try to explain our country to these people. And one of my friends was very political. Steve was a wood turner, just passed away last year. He was one of the early members of Amnesty International. And so there was, we talked about politics, and we talked about, everything. Not too much about sports, and it's too bad because I'm a big sports guy, but I found that other places.
Well, I really like the rhythm of the pottery in that way, where you work really hard for an hour and a half, and then you take a break, and then you work really hard for another hour and a half. It's like it's almost allows you to sprint in the work pace,
Yes,
because you're
absolutely.
taking a focused break. So how does that inform the way? Like, what's your work cycle now, all these years later? Like, how do you plan the cycle within your life?
Of course, I had many chapters. I now am working out in the middle of the woods, by myself. I had a very public life for a long, long time. I had a shop in the middle of downtown Fredericksburg for most of my career. So things keep changing, and I'm now officially a senior citizen. So I'm perhaps not pushing quite as hard physically as I used to. I mean, I used to be in the shop. I kind of work banker's hours because I ran a retail shop most of my life. So my working day starts at 10. And then I'm in the studio to anywhere till 6 to 8 in the evening. And I'm not very good about taking time off. If there's nothing going on, I go to the studio every single day. And I've done that all my adult life. It's just I still find it enormously compelling. When the pandemic came, I thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to read more. And I'm going to sit home, and I'd sit for half an hour reading a book on a Tuesday afternoon and think, I can't do this. I got to be making things. So, and then I have a big kiln now that I used to have. When I was in town, I had a small gas kiln. So a very different rhythm to the rhythm I have now. And so I have a big Bory box wood-fired kiln that it's 2 chambers, but I've basically been firing just the first chamber the last few years. So everything kind of works around there. It takes me 2 to 3 months perhaps to fill the kiln. I make a lot of small work. Most of my work, again, this goes back to Winchcombe, but most of my work is made for the table or for the kitchen still. And I mean, I play a lot. I mean, my work's all over the place, but I've made my living that way. So I put a lot of pots in my kiln, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so it's cooling now. And I got a peek in last night, which has given me a little bit of confidence, because I have a new glaze I'm playing with, and I mixed a big batch of it up for the first time, and I was a little uncertain as to whether I'd mixed it up properly. But I still put it on 100 pots, and but they look okay. So I can sleep at night. But it's, the pandemic changed my rhythm too, Ben, because opportunities, shows went away, opportunities went away. And I think I've worked the same. I mean, when I went to load this kiln last week, I realized I have 2 kiln loads of pots that I could, I've made so many pots, but I hadn't fired since just before St. Croix. I'm really lucky to do that show now. So I did 2 firings in April, and then I haven't fired since then. So, and I kind of like that, because I like just, sticking into the mud and just making and making and making and making and making and making. In town, I could fill the kiln in 10 days. So very different rhythm. And I like, I don't think I'd have liked a life where things stayed the same all the time. This is a different time, and it feels like next year is going to get busier. And so I'm planning more firings as the time goes by. But I don't even really stop for lunch. I'll just go over and grab a bite out of my sandwich, and some days I don't even bring sandwiches anymore. I just eat a couple of biscuits and apple and drink too much tea and keep going, because I find I'm still obsessive about the studio. I don't, if I want to go for a walk, I've got to get out of my car, because I drive out to the studio. It's about 10 miles from my house. It's on a farm that belongs to friends of mine, and it's a beautiful place. If I get out of my car and I walk in the studio, I'm done. I won't do anything else but make things. If I get out of the car and go for a walk first through the woods, I feel a lot better, but I struggle to do that. I want to get in there and make things. It's always this, I don't know, a little desperation almost, but it still exists today.
That studio is relatively new, because I've seen pictures of you. You built that. Was that last year, 2 years ago?
Yeah, it was last summer. Actually, the first time I didn't build a studio, I paid a contractor a crazy amount of money. It was in the worst time to build a studio in the world. The prices of everything went insane. But I've been out there for about 15 years, off the grid. But I've had some real problems with mold out there. This property is on an old riverbed, and I got sick from my studio. Basically, got me sick. So built a really sweet studio, and this farm belongs to a friend of mine who I'll talk about a little later, who's an angel, and she declared that I was going to have electricity. So I am now illuminated. I have a tea kettle. I have a refrigerator. It's just, I don't feel like I'm worthy of these things, but and I'm still getting used to it. I still forget sometimes. I could just turn on the lights. So I used to have a little solar lighting system, but it was pretty inadequate. So yes, I have a new studio, which is great, and it's, I plan to keep making pots for a very long time, and so to have this really nice spiffy space, and we all, how we build the space around us is really critical, and I don't like big spaces. I pick up a tool or something, so it's a fairly intimate space, and attached right to my kiln shed. So I walk right out the door, right to the kiln, and my kiln's under a big shed. It's quite protected. So it's a very comfortable little compound. I have another building out there, and over the years I've built planted an apple orchard, and had bees for a while out there. It's a beautiful. I have a 2-acre field that's surrounded by woods on all 4 sides, and I drive down a mile road to get to it. So I had a really public life for a long time, and now I have quite a private life, and it's time for that.
I wanted to talk about the way you've developed surfaces to match the way you're firing. So now it's a Bori box, so you can, you have that natural reduction oxidation going back and forth with a wood kiln. But I think there's the firing that gives it a certain flavor, but there's also the way that you apply slip. So I've noticed that a lot of your pots, it will be directional slip, either brushing or combing. That will be kind of the base layer. And then there'll be something over top of that, like taking a tick mark, like carving out of it. but they're all about movement. It's like a gestural movement. That's the base of the aesthetic. So can you talk about your attraction to using slips in that way?
Well, of course, it all starts with the salt, because I salt and wood fire. When I first built the kiln, I had two chambers. I was going to wood fire the first one, salt the second one, but I was never really happy with the wood chamber, so I salt it entirely now. I the one again, it comes from Winchcombe, but my work as I make my work, it's very tight. I throw very precisely, but I'm attracted to work that's a little warmer and looser. So decoration is part of how I'm loosening up my work. It's funny, I always tell people I'm not a decorator, but what I mean by that is I don't hold a brush. I think that you're a decorator. You do beautiful things with a brush. If I pick up a brush, it's almost always a disaster, unless it's a big wide brush and I'm just painting a big surface on there. So I think about my decorating as building up layers. And so you're precisely right that I often will rib the surface of the pot to create some little edges, and then I'm slipping it, and then I'm kind of combing through it with a really rough piece of broom. And then when that sets up, I usually chatter it, which is another layer. And then I sometimes slip trail on top of that. So there's 3 or 4 different sort of subtle layers on that surface, and then I'm putting them in that kiln. And I don't see a lot of results from the ash because the salt tends to overwhelm it. I tell people I fire with wood because I like to fire with wood. I'm not really using the wood as a decoration. Although it does affect it. I mean, it lands on some of the glazes that I use that are ash based. It creates crystals when they land on the ash on there. So I do get subtle things, but mostly I'm looking for the salt. And because it's a cross draft, I'm now getting, that change from one side to the other, which is again loosens up those pots a bit. So by the time I'm done, I feel like I've, taken my nature, which is to make these really precise things, but then to sort of soften them all through the process. I wish I could control that reduction. The kiln that we had in England was much bigger than mine, and it had a firebox on either side of the kiln with a chimney in the back. And in that kiln, we could maintain reduction throughout, because as you stoked one firebox, the other was like in full, flame. And so you always could keep that atmosphere the same. But as you said, mine varies. And there's a couple of glazes I'd love to use, but I'm not able to because they like solid reduction through the firing. I just stuck a test in this firing again. I'm always hoping I can make it work. So, but I'm not too sure it will. So yeah, and then the kiln, it suits me. If I put my pots in one of my friends, Onagama kilns, it would destroy what I'm doing on the surface. I think, it's really important that we marry the firing process to the aesthetic that we're looking for, and to be compatible with sort of how you like to make the pots. And certainly I feel like I'm in a really good place right now where feel like I'm putting those things together in a way that makes me really happy.
So at this point, you've been making pots for decades. In the English tradition, it is a tradition, like it is a path to follow. And I know that was your start, but I see some of that in the work now, but I don't think that necessarily overwhelms your individual voice. So how did you learn to stray from tradition? Or how did you learn to evolve from it?
Well, it wasn't easy, I have to tell you. I mean, especially in fact, when I came back to the States, I basically started a mini Winchcombe pottery. I had a couple of employees, and I came to Fredericksburg. I took over a pottery in Fredericksburg that had already existed, but it was failing, and so I was employed to run this pottery in Fredericksburg. And so I created a production line. Each person on the team made different pots. It was just like Winchcombe, although we weren't making their work. Certainly a lot of the forms from there, but we were using different glazes. And and I used to say that, Ray Finch sat on my shoulder for many, many years. And I would like think, oh, Ray would hate this if I did this, and it'd be like, I really wanted to. It's a privilege and a tiny little bit of a burden then, because I felt enormously privileged to have worked there. For a long time, I used to be able to say I was the only American that ever worked there. Laterally, one of my assistants, Jason Hartso, spent some time there about 5 years ago. But when I left, I thought, well, I've been given this gift, and I'm now part of this legacy. And how do I keep that in my life? And it was so influential in the early days. And it took a long, long time for me to sort of be brave enough to start to say, there's more in me than that. I could not have spent my life working there, because, once you learned how to make a pot, you made that pot forever and ever and ever. And I think I had just enough art college experience and my sort of interest in the sculptural side of clay that over time I've sort of slowly introduced new ideas. And it's my work is, there's no definitive Dan Finnegan pot out there. It's, my work has always evolved, and it's why it's interesting to me still. I'm forever asking questions. I made a vow long ago that I'd always have tests in my kiln. So I'm always making certain pots that, I know are going to work and I know are going to be good for my business. There's always new things in there that I'm trying. A lot of those are in my woods, but a new idea then sort of leads to another thing. It's been a very slow evolution. This is, I guess, my 42nd year making pots in Fredericksburg. Last year, I did a retrospective at the local university. And even I was surprised at the variation of work throughout this, my life. And I'm very proud of that. I don't want to just have a couple of ideas and then just crank them out. I want to keep exploring. In fact, it's a word I think about myself a lot, that I'm an explorer. I'm a somewhat conservative explorer in a way. And I don't do a lot of, there's people out there like Mike Helke that, just blow my mind. I mean,
Yeah, me too.
I wish I could be Mike Helke, but I am not. And but that's the kind of, I feel, compared to folks like my changes are very subtle and slow and somewhat conservative, perhaps. But I've really never had a safety net. I've been I've had to support myself my whole entire life. Although I've had angels in my life, let me tell you, there's a lot of people that have been really kind to me. So I've always had to be careful as far as not straying too far from what I feel like I can be successful as a business person, which has been important to me all my life.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Amico Brent. For the past 100 years, Amico Brent has been creating ceramic supplies for our community, ranging from underglazes to electric kilns, and they have no plans of slowing down. With over 3,000 products, Amico Brent's top priority is making sure that all of their customer needs are met. From the professional to the student and everyone in between, their high-quality materials enable you to make your best work. To learn more, check them out at amico.com or on Instagram and Facebook at Amico Brent. You can also show them how you use Amico by sharing your work online with the hashtag HowIAmico. One of the things we're experiencing right now is inflation. And I think that the way that relates to potters raising, well, in my opinion, potters don't increase their prices with inflation generally, because every year there's about 2 to 3% inflation. And last year, I think there was like 9% or something like that. So now people are talking about it more. But theoretically, every year we should raise our prices a little bit to keep up with just the way things are. So can you talk about your relationship to pricing and how you're thinking about that now that we're in an inflation period?
Well, it's funny. I never worry about like the material costs, and I have friends who really worry about them. I mean, I still use alumina in my wadding, and a lot of my friends like, oh, it's so expensive. I was like, but I buy a bag of alumina, it lasts me for 3 years. You know, I mean, the percentage of that cost into my pot is like infinitesimal, just like the price of the clay itself. So on some level, I don't worry too much about that, but I do think about pricing a great deal. And my evolution from that goes from Winchcombe, where Winchcombe Ray made pots through World War II and through depressions, and so his idea of how pottery being really, really affordable for everybody completely infected me when I was there. And when I came back to the States, that was absolutely how. I mean, my first mugs I wholesaled for $2.25 a piece in 1980, and I sold them in lots of 50 and 100. And I believed in that. I thought, I want everybody who can afford a pot. Everybody wants a pot to be able to afford it. Over time, I began to realize that in spite of how low my prices were, I was not reaching, working class people or lower class people. People buying my pots drove really nice cars. They wore really nice clothes. They lived in really nice houses. And I'm living on the poverty line at the time. And I thought, something's not right here. And so I just started, I don't know, I guess I started embracing more contemporary business practices, which is to look at the world we're in and to sort of my prices grow with the world. But also I wanted to be more secure. I wanted to be able to train other people. And so I needed to have more cash. I guess my response in the early days was just, my needs were greater. I had to raise my prices to meet those needs. Now I'm in a place where I kind of use price. We can all sell mugs till the day we die, and I'm happy to make mugs, but I now charge a price for my mugs that slows down the sale of mugs. I kind of use price in a way. So if there's things I really want to make, I might price them a little lower than they should warrant because I want to make them. And I price other things in a way that's, if you really want that mug, it's going to, it might hurt a little bit. I was talking to somebody the other day, or no, a couple of years ago, sorry, a younger person, and he was mad. He said, your generation's done nothing for our generation. And I said, come on, man. So I told him the story. I said, $2.25 for a mug. What do you charge for a mug? Well, he was like charging $75, I think, at the time. And I thought, you're welcome. I said, my generation, because I think we live in a field where and it's changed a lot, but our audience kind of almost dictated to us that pottery should be cheap. I mean, I'm reading a book about the history of Jugtown at the moment, and this guy's talking about buying a casserole for $8. He says, "Well, it's a bit expensive, but I think it's probably worth it." That's how people used to think that pottery should be, like cheap as could be, and I think over my lifetime, there's a lot of people in our audience has really changed and begun to appreciate the artfulness of what we do, and that it's it goes beyond just servicing the base utility. But I am building a new studio and spending way more money than I thought. I need to recover some of that money, and so earlier this year I thought I'm going to make $100 mug. Because we have peers now who are charging that kind of money for a piece of extraordinary pieces, and so I years ago I made a sprig mold of myself because of the old Bartman bottles, and so I made a bunch of steins and I put myself on them, little Robert Arneson action, and when I came out of the kiln, I was like, I still can't charge $100 for these. It's that same struggle that we all talk about, that the more expensive your work gets, the more precious it becomes, and yet we want people to use our things. So my gift is that I make a lot of pots, so I can charge a fair price, and I do feel it's fair. But I certainly don't give my work away. I know who's buying it, and I'm grateful that they buy it. But I'm also, I don't know how long I can keep working, but I hope to work for a long, long time. But, we need to be thinking about our futures. I won't retire, but how to financially take care of myself as I get older. And those are all important. And I've paid attention to those things for probably, I don't know, I think it took me 10 years to kind of get my head around that idea that I needed to be a better business person. And so I've been pretty pretty focused on that. And I'm a preacher in a way too, Ben, because years ago, my friend Toff I learned a lot from him all the time. He asked me many, many years ago, because I had no health insurance at the time. He said, what happens when you break your arm? How are you going to live? And I had no answer, but he had an answer, which was, he said, you need inventory. And he declared, and he does this himself, he's got way more than a year's worth of pots on hand at any given time. And I feel like that's my bank account. Again, because, and he said, and the only way you can build up inventory, he said, you can make more pots or you can raise your prices. And I really can't make more pots. I make a lot of pots. And so raising my prices was the way I could slow down the numbers of pots that I sold, but still keep the income where I wanted it to be and slowly build up an inventory. And I have functioned that way for a very long time. So when a show comes up, I'm not taking pots that are burning my fingers out of the kiln to pack them in a box and run off to a show. I go to my inventory and pull out the pots that I want. I'm always making new things, but I don't have that sort of anxiety that comes with that, which I think could give people a lot of peace if they could bring themselves to do that. So the other thing I remember, I resisted having credit cards. I mean, this is how old I am, is that I was, credit cards kind of came along and I resisted taking them in my shop. Again, Toff says, well, why aren't you taking credit cards? I said, because they take 3% of my, my sale. He said, so raise your prices 10%. I thought, oh my goodness, sure, I can do that. And boom, I took credit cards. So I sometimes need to have somebody, kind of smack me upside the head to see what needs to be seen. But I think, I want to keep making pots. It's been my feeling all my life. And so I have to be smart about business. And I have run business. I've also started and ran an art center for a dozen years. And, I've had a bunch of people I've employed over the years. So being a good businessman has allowed me to also, participate in my community and bring good things in my community and help young people on their way. So it's really about me, but it doesn't hurt that I can also be really, a good person in other ways, because I'm not flat broke all the time.
Well, I think it's a really good lesson for younger potters to hear that you do have to change sometimes outside of your comfort zone. Like your friend, your peer, Toff, can rib you and get you to make a change that if I was saying that to you, it probably wouldn't work. You know what I mean? Like there's something about like a peer-to-peer thing where you can be challenged in a friendly way, but you shift faster, which I think it's good to have people like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yep. And I've not had a lot, because again, I wasn't real connected in the pottery world in my younger days, but that friendship with him has been so constant, and spending 2 months with him every summer, working alongside of him, so it was just always just brilliant for me. So
what do you think about the state of this is a weird term, but like the English countryside pottery? What do you think about that now? Because there are people still working in that same way. I mean, a lot of the older generation, I mean, I guess some of them are retiring, but a lot of people are making pots into their 80s or even longer. And then there does seem to be a newer generation coming behind them. Do you have any thoughts on that, being an American that sees that every summer?
Well, yeah, it's in some ways, I think you're maybe thinking of Doug Fitch and Hannah McAndrew a little bit,
Yeah.
Who are very dear friends of mine. They absolutely plumb, 17th century slipware. They both do it in different ways. And they are enormously successful with that work. I think of it a little bit like going down to Seagrove, Ben, that there's not just all those potters there, but there's a whole community that appreciates the history of that place, and so are interested in work that springs from there. And I think that's just as true in England, that that work, from that time especially, is still really, I mean, and those houses over there are hundreds of years old, and sometimes there's objects in there that haven't been moved out of there in hundreds of years. You come across old pots all the time. I mean, they have these things called car boot sales, like little flea markets, and you can find 200-year-old slipware pots all the time there. They were so ubiquitous. So I think that there's a familiarity in the sort of British pottery community, the sort of buying community. And so as Doug and Hannah started making their work, the response was enormously strong. And then there's folks like Clive Bowen, who Clive was also sort of a Winchcombe follower, and fires earthenware in a bottle kiln. And his work is very, very steeped in tradition. But interestingly, his son uses all the same materials and makes this incredibly contemporary work, which is also very, very popular. So both things, I mean, there's always been in England this interesting mix of urban ceramics and rural ceramics. The sort of the London folks made very, very different work than sort of the Winchcombe folks, or Johnny Leach at Muchelney, or all these sort of production potteries. Johnny has passed on, but the pottery's still functioning. But I think there's probably a finite end to that place. Winchcombe went through a huge rough patch after Ray died, partly because he didn't do a very good job of figuring out what was going to happen after his demise. And it's doing better these days. There's a young man working there now. There's a team of 3 people there now, but in its heyday, it had 8. So the interest is just, it's changed. People are buying, some of that work, and certainly Doug and Hannah's work, which is magnificent. They don't have any trouble selling their work, but they're also really good at publicity and social media and things like that. And so they've coupled. I always think this is a fascinating time that we're coupling, this crazy computer world, and then, attaching it to these incredibly traditional, old-fashioned ways of working. And we need both ends of that to survive, I think, today. But I think, there's more individual potters there. I don't think you'll see a lot of new sort of production places coming up. I think those days, at least for now, aren't as interested as sort of more individual work. That's the thing in my life too. I used to sell sets of everything, mixing bowl sets, canister sets. People buy an object now, and I think that's true there too. There's a lot of parallels between us and they. A lot more salt glazing there because they don't have a lot of wood. They cut their forest down 1,000 years ago. So there's a lot more salt than wood. Here, I think it's maybe the opposite. But that's more just a physical limitation, I suppose.
Well, I wanted to wrap up thinking and talking about Pottery on the Hill, which is a sale that you've put together, which I want you to tell me about the history of that, but also why you think it's important to bring potters from other places into Northern Virginia, like what that does as an educational tool.
Well, it's certainly a part of what we think we're doing. Washington is obviously this incredibly vibrant city with a lot of, highly educated people who come from all over the world to live there and work there. And yet there's very little, other than the museums, which are extraordinary, there's not a lot of pottery in there. When in the early 80s, there was a couple of great galleries. There was a great gallery in Georgetown. I remember going there, and there was a line around the block of people waiting to get into the gallery to buy pottery. A very different time. But they're gone. And there's, other than the Smithsonian Craft Show, which used to be really great for working potters, but is less so now. It's gotten more, I don't know, esoteric, I suppose, and sort of useful pots have been diminished in that show. So I felt like there was a big gap there. I actually started the show because the folks who own my farm live in DC, and they spearheaded the renovation of this extraordinary building. It was a Civil War era naval hospital that had gone into huge disrepair, and it sat abandoned for, well, actually since Martin Luther King was assassinated, because that's the neighborhood where the riots happened. And for a long time, that whole neighborhood was just, it was like a bomb site. So that neighborhood started getting revived. My friends, Nikki and Steve Simrot, run a foundation on Capitol Hill that spearheaded the renovation of that building. And they did an extraordinary job. It's got all geothermal heat and air conditioning. I mean, they did it right. And when they got towards the completion of the project, Nikki, my studio is on her farm, and I pay her absolutely no money. So she is my angel. And
Wow.
So when she asked me if I would start a show, I was delighted to be able to do so. Plus, Ben, I never liked doing shows much in America. When my early days, I'd be in an agricultural stall where there'd been goats the week before. And I always thought that potters, we deserve a more elegant environment, and we certainly can fit in there. And so the idea that I could do an all pottery show, which there aren't too many around here. Of course, Demarest is the granddaddy of them all. In an intimate show, in an elegant building, in the capital of the country, it just seemed like it couldn't go wrong. I mean, it was fraught with a lot getting it off the ground, because here I had to go and invite potters. I knew a few of the folks I invited. Others I just knew of by reputation. But I wanted it to be, as you say, somewhat of an educational experience for people who came. So I've always tried to have a lot of diversity in ways people work, and how they fire, as well as being diverse in every other way we can. And we're doing a better job now than we were when we started. And I believe that's worked. And so once we kind of got the idea of the show in place, and I invited a group, and it was interesting because I was not known much in the pottery world in those days. So I thought I made a list of 50 people I thought I'm going to invite, hoping I could get the 15 people I was looking for. But I invited the first 15, and only one person declined. So people thought this was a really good idea. And it was appealing to folks in a way that surprised me, but also delighted me. So I thought, well, what other resources are there? And so through Warren, Frederick, and Catherine White, who are really great friends with Louise Court, who was the head of ceramics for the Smithsonian for many years and wrote all the books, on Chinese and Asian ceramics. We invited Louise to come and give a talk. So we opened the show with this incredible person talking about both old pots and new pots. So we've had famous flower arrangers from the Smithsonian come and do workshops with that. So I've been trying to bring food into the show for a long time, but I have a tremendous relationship with the staff at the Hill Center, but it's a collaboration. I'm not, and can be awkward. I kind of walk into the building and I say, okay, we're going to do this and this and this and this and this. And it's like, you hope you can finesse that and still have a good relationship. And we do it. They love the show up there. So they have a demonstration kitchen, and I continue to try to push to get, classes happening during the show. And we haven't gotten there yet, but we continue to add more things. And then for the potters, the fact that we invited Louise, she said, well, isn't there a time when the potters could all come and meet me and we go in the basement of the Freer Sackler and look at ancient pots? I was like, yes. So we set up Friday morning, and then we have a quick lunch, and then I have to herd all these people on the subway on the metro to the Smithsonian, which is probably my biggest challenge all weekend. Trying to get Sam Taylor to go in the right direction is always a challenge. So we go there and we meet Louise and another of the curators, and we go in the basement, and we're handling 3,000-year-old pots. We can take pots out of these cabinets, and we sit around a table, and there's Louise and these curators and us as makers discussing a little tea ball, that's just, I can't tell you how valuable that time is. And really, sadly, this year we can't go in the basement because of COVID. We're going to go through the museum itself. But, lots of great things happened out of there. And particularly Michael Klein. I have a photograph of Michael Klein holding this inlaid Korean bowl. And that's the moment, because Michael does all this inlay now. And there's that moment, which is on my phone today. Sorry, I hit the table again. So all kinds of brilliant things come out of it. And it continues to add layers to the show that make coming to the show really valuable. And it's a good sale. The sales have been great. They grow every year. This is our 11th year this year. And we're, of course, we haven't been in person the last couple of years, so we're really excited to be back in person. We're going to continue to try to hold it online. Some of the folks will be online as well. And it's wonderful. We have young people who are volunteers that do all the packing and sales, but we also provide them a place to sell their work. So we're kind of encouraging the next generation. In fact, this year, 2 of my earliest helpers are now in the show, and I'm going to continue to sort of graduate them, into the big kids club, which is really just, I'm really proud of that. I think it's really nice to be able to keep the younger generation going along, or coming forward.
And that's coming up soon. That's in 2 weeks. Can you leave the website for that and tell a little bit more about where it is and the dates?
Well, it's the 11th to the 13th of November at the Hill Center, which is right on Capitol Hill. It's right on Constitution Avenue. You can see the Capitol building from the building. And there's a reception Friday night. It's a paid reception. I think it's $40 to come. And then it's free the rest of the weekend. There will be raccoon firings out in the yard on Saturday. And then there'll be 3 decoration demonstrations on Sunday. Catherine White and Donna Paulsino and Michael Klein are all going to do demos. So there's lots of reasons to come and lots of reasons to come back. And of course, to support your local and not so local potters is always a very good thing. So, but it's a wonderful, intimate show. It's the size that we all can sit together at dinner. Some amazing friendships have evolved, because I sort of, the original group is sort of like the permanent members, and then I invite guests. So we had, the same core come every year, and then there's new people involved, which I think is a really wonderful mix. And some beautiful friendships have grown, and so it's like a reunion when we get back together. And the staff at the Hill Center, love like Michael, Hunt, Naomi's kids. So there's just all this. It's so beautiful. It's just ridiculous, truthfully, but in many, many good ways. So I can't wait for it to happen. And I'll be nervous until we get there. It's kind of a nerve-wracking thing, being in charge of all these, and wanting to make money and provide for a really good experience for these people who I admire, these folks who come to sell. I can't explain how much I admire them. So I feel a great responsibility to make sure it's a great experience.
Also, can you leave your website just in case people wanted to get in touch and talk about anything we talked about today? I'm
Dan Finnegan, pottery.com. That's my website. Pottery on the Hill. We do have, hillcenterdc.org is how you can find, and they have great, information about all the potters and all the events that are happening on their site. So you can learn a lot more about the individual people and all the activities at the Hill Center. If you live anywhere near DC, it's an extraordinary cultural center with a myriad of events happening all the time, music and lectures and classes. And so it's a really lively place. And this is what they call their signature event of the year, which is really quite cool. Well, thanks for taking the time to do this today. I really appreciate it. Well, it's a bucket list thing, Ben. Thank you for asking me. I'd like to thank Dan for coming on the show.
It was a pleasure to chat with him and to talk about his early days in the UK. I really enjoyed researching Winchcombe pottery to prepare for this episode, so make sure to check out the Instagram posts of Dan in 1979 with the rest of the crew that I'll be posting at my Instagram feed. You can find that at Carter Pottery. I wanted to take a minute to thank today's sponsor, Amico Brent. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch through our Brickyard Network website. And also, while we're on that topic, I wanted to congratulate Angelique and Alex for finishing their second season of Clay and Color. If you're not listening to that podcast already, I recommend you check it out. You can find it on all major podcast apps, as well as on the website, which is brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities whose lands we reside on in the United States, and recognize that we are uninvited guests on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of over 500 nations indigenous to North America. By acknowledging and reflecting upon the contemporary lived experiences and histories of the Indigenous peoples here and globally, we may begin to take essential steps towards creating a more equitable world. Learn more through the hashtag Honor Native Land initiative of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and consider contributing to Indigenous-led organizations doing important work to further health and wellness, sovereignty, and self-determination of the first people of the lands you reside. This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.